What have you
vessel
done?
like a dying animal cutting through the silence of deep space with a sound that meant
What have you done?
military interceptors. Captain Garrett Ashford's hands moved across the navigation console with practiced efficiency, fingers dancing through shutdown sequences, even as the first volley of weapons fire tore through the outer hull. The USS Horizon's Edge wasn't built for combat. She was a scientific platform, elegant and fragile, designed for discovery rather than war. Everyone on board knew what those sleek Valoran ships meant. Everyone knew how this would end. Get everyone to the escape pods, Garrett commanded, his voice steady despite the vibration that traveled up through the deck, plating and into his bones. The ship shuddered again, heavier this time, and somewhere in the engineering section, something critical was failing. The lights flickered, stabilized, then flickered again. His second officer turned with panic written across his face, but Garrett was already moving to the next console. Isolating the sensitive data cores, wiping encrypted files that detailed human outpost locations across the Colorado sector. His fingers worked faster as another impact rocked the vessel. Delete, overwrite, corrupt. When they found him, they would find a captain who went down with his ship. More importantly, they would find nothing useful. The boarding craft attached itself to the docking port with a metallic shriek that echoed through the dying ship. Garrett had maybe 90 seconds. His hands flew across the final sequences, ensuring that decades of exploration data coordinates of vulnerable colonies, patrol routes, and defense protocols all dissolved into meaningless static. The console went dark. Mission accomplished. When the boarding party came through the corridor in perfect formation, weapons raised, Garrett was waiting for them. 6 Valoran soldiers, all taller and stronger than any human built for combat in ways his species had never achieved naturally. He raised his hands slowly and smiled at them like he was greeting old friends. "Welcome aboard," he said calmly. "I'm afraid the coffee in the galley is terrible. Standard exploration crew supplies." One of them stepped forward, a female with dark violet skin that seemed to glow under the emergency lighting, silver blonde hair, pulled back in a military braid, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her irises shifted between violet and blue as she studied him, holding an intelligence that seemed to burn with its own gravity. The insignia on her uniform marked her as commander, and something about the way the other soldiers deferred to her suggested she was someone important. "Captain Garrett Ashford of the human exploration vessel," she said, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. "You're coming with us." He didn't correct her about wanting to be called just Garrett. Seemed unimportant now. As 2 of her soldiers secured restraints around his wrists, he caught the briefest hint of her scent. Something like electrical current and burning metal, the byproduct of Valoran biology. Her gaze met his for just a moment, and something flickered there. Curiosity, maybe? Or just the cold assessment of whether he posed any real threat. He did. She just didn't know it yet. Neither did he, for that matter. Not really. Not in any way he could articulate or understand. Just a feeling buried somewhere deep in his cells, a knowledge that shouldn't exist but did anyway. The interrogation chamber was exactly what he expected. Cold, clinical, designed to make a person feel small and insignificant against the vast machinery of Valoran military power. The walls were a pale gray that absorbed light rather than reflected it, and the single chair in the center sat beneath fixtures so bright they turned everything colorless. They asked him the same questions for 3 days straight. How many human outposts existed in the sector? What was the extent of human military capabilities? Were there other ships in the region operating under similar exploratory mandates? Garrett answered with careful misdirection, deflecting with half-truths, lying about specifics while seeding just enough plausible information to keep them interested but doubting. It was a dance he'd been trained for, though he had never expected to actually use that training. Different interrogators cycled through in shifts. Some tried intimidation. Others attempted to build rapport. None of them got anything useful, and Garrett could see the frustration building behind their questions. On the 3rd day, something changed. Commander Lissa Kaylor came to the interrogation chamber alone. She was even more striking in the harsh white light than she'd been during the initial capture. Her lavender skin seemed to glow under the fixture's patterns of slightly darker pigmentation along her cheekbones and the bridge of her nose, creating symmetries that were completely alien, yet somehow elegant. The silver blonde hair fell in waves past her shoulders, now released from the military braid, and those eyes, iridescent and constantly flowing through shades of violet and blue, held an intensity that made Garrett sit up straighter in his chair. I'm Commander Lysa Kalor, she said, dismissing the guards with a gesture. They left without question. The door sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to emphasize the sudden isolation. The others are wasting time with crude questions. I want to understand how your mind works. Garrett tested the restraints that held him to the chair. Valoran-grade military specification. Heavy, sophisticated, designed to hold beings much stronger than humans. He could feel the weight of them, the certainty of their construction. And yet somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that he could break them if he needed to. The thought came automatically instinctive, a knowledge that shouldn't be there at all. He filed it away to examine later. My mind works like any human mind. He said carefully, meeting her stare. We're not so different from you. We love, we fear, we want to survive. Lysa circled him slowly, her movements precise and controlled. Every step measured, every gesture deliberate. You're different, she said. Our analysts say humans are primitive, biologically soft. Yet you commanded a ship. You coordinated evacuation under fire. You were destroying data when we arrived systematically and methodically, not in panic. That requires something our profiles don't account for. I was protecting my people, Garrett said. That's what any captain would do. That's what I'm trying to understand. She stopped in front of him close enough that he could see the constant shifting of color within her irises, like auroras dancing in an alien sky. What's worth protecting them for? What's worth dying for? Garrett held her stare. The same things you die for, I imagine. Home, purpose, connection to something larger than yourself. Something flickered in her expression, a crack in the professional distance she was maintaining. She turned away, but not before he caught it. A moment of recognition, of something shared despite the gulf of species and circumstance between them. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, almost vulnerable. They want me to execute you, she said. Make an example. Show that human resistance is futile and that the Valoran fleet tolerates no interference in this sector. Garrett kept his voice neutral. What do you want? She didn't answer. Instead, she simply left, and the guards returned to their positions outside the chamber. But Garrett had seen something in those luminous eyes. She was capable of cruelty. The intelligence behind them suggested it. The authority she wielded confirmed it. But she wasn't cruel in the way predators were cruel. She was something more dangerous than that. She was conflicted. The cell was barely larger than a closet on a human ship, but the Valoran didn't seem to design spaces with comfort in mind. Everything was built for beings larger and stronger than Garrett Wedge, which made the isolation feel even more profound. The walls thrummed with the ship's engines, a constant reminder that he was suspended in the void surrounded by an alien species that saw his kind as primitive and disposable. He'd been there for 4 days when Lysa came to him alone. The guards didn't follow. She simply dismissed them with a hand gesture, and they complied without question. Command privilege, Garrett realized. She had enough authority that no one questioned her access to him, even in violation of whatever protocols governed prisoner treatment. You're not trying to escape, she said, stepping into the cell. The space suddenly felt much smaller with her in it, the door sealed behind her. I've reviewed the security footage. You test the restraints when you're alone, but not aggressively. You could force the issue if you wanted. Why don't you? I'm waiting, Garrett said simply. For what? To understand what happens next. Running gets me killed immediately. Staying alive keeps options open. Lysa sat on the bunk beside him. It was an informal gesture that violated every military protocol he could imagine. Her leg nearly touched his. The proximity was deliberate, he realized. She was testing something. Testing him. Testing herself. You're remarkably calm about facing execution, she said. Are you going to execute me? Garrett asked. She looked at her hands, long-fingered, elegant, capable of both violence and gentleness. I don't know yet, she admitted. Garrett studied her profile, the pointed curve of her ear, the way her silver hair caught the dim light of the cell, the tension in her shoulders that suggested this conversation was costing her something. You didn't come here to interrogate me, he said quietly. You could do that with a chair and a recording device, Willem. No, she agreed. I didn't. The silence stretched between them, charged with something neither of them had names for. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability he hadn't heard before. What's Earth like? Garrett smiled. It's green, he said. Everything grows there without permission or planning. There are oceans that go on forever and forests so dense you can't see the sky. The air doesn't taste like recycled filters. It tastes like pine and rain and soil. There's weather actual unpredictability. Nothing is controlled or managed. Every day is different. Sounds chaotic, Lassa said. It is. It's also beautiful in ways that are hard to explain. You have to experience it to understand. She turned to face him fully. Her gaze was very close now, close enough that he could see every shift of color within her eyes and every nuance of emotion reflected in their iridescent depths. Why are you different from what our profiles predicted? She asked. Maybe your profiles are wrong, Garrett said. Her hand came up slowly, not aggressive, just a single finger tracing the edge of his jawline. She was testing whether he'd pull away, he realized. Testing the boundaries of this strange connection forming between them. Instead of pulling back, he leaned slightly into the touch. Every interaction with you contradicts what I've been taught, she whispered. About humans. About what you're capable of. About what you deserve. Is that dangerous, Garrett asked. For you or for me, both? Her hand dropped. She stood abruptly, moving toward the door. I shouldn't come back here, she said. But they both knew she would. She returned the next night and the night after that. The conversations deepened, with each visit layers of professional distance peeling away to reveal something raw and honest underneath. She told him about the isolation of command, how everyone on the fleet expected her to embody military perfection, to never show uncertainty or doubt. He told her about Earth in greater detail, about the weight of captaincy and the burden of making decisions that determined whether people lived or died. On the fifth night, when her hand found his in the darkness of the cell, neither of them pulled away. Her fingers were cool against his palm, and the touch sparked something in his nervous system. Awareness. Desire. The primitive understanding that they were crossing a line that once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. They sat like that for a long time, neither speaking, both understanding that words would only complicate what was happening between them. They're pressuring me to make a decision about you, she said quietly, her fingers intertwining with his. The council thinks you're a threat to fleet cohesion. Some of the soldiers have become interested in your perspective, in the things you've said during interrogation. They're asking questions they shouldn't ask, questions about what Garrett asked, about what you said, about humans not being inferior, about whether we've been wrong about so many things. She squeezed his hand and he could feel the tremor running through her. I can protect you, but not indefinitely. Sooner or later, I'll have to make a choice that I don't want to make. Garrett knew what that choice would be. Military hierarchies didn't tolerate prolonged indecision, especially not from their commanders. Resources had to be allocated. Examples had to be made. Messages had to be sent. But as Lysa left that night, her fingers trailing away from his slowly, reluctantly, he found himself strangely calm about whatever came next, because she cared enough to keep coming to him. That was already extraordinary. The council's directive came down through official channels 2 days later. A communique stamped with the highest authority marks, delivered by a subordinate officer who wouldn't meet Lyssa's gaze. Garrett saw it the morning they came to tell him, saw the way her face had become stone, the way nothing showed except in her hands, which trembled slightly as she held the datapad. Execution, she said, her voice clipped and professional, in a way it hadn't been during their night visits. Protocol dictates it will occur in 24 hours. I'm required to oversee the preparations personally. The guards were watching. She couldn't look at him the way she wanted to. Couldn't show anything that might suggest their relationship had become something other than captor and prisoner. Thank you for telling me, Garrett said carefully. After she left, he sat on the bunk and let the reality settle over him like a weight. He'd known this was coming. Some part of him had always understood that their connection couldn't exist long-term, that it could only exist in stolen moments, in whispered conversations, sheltered from the demanding eyes of military hierarchy and political necessity. But understanding something intellectually and feeling it were different things entirely. Lyssa returned 12 hours later. She was alone again, carrying what looked like ceremonial restraints. Beautiful and terrible in equal measure, elegant technology studded with power nodes and binding mechanisms that gleamed under the harsh light of the corridor. Military execution restraints designed to be both functional and symbolic. These will hold you during the ceremony, she said, her voice carefully neutral. The process is painless. The Valoran way is efficient and quick. Garrett stood. He could have fought, The knowledge of his own capability thrummed in his muscles in the very cells of his body. That strange certainty that he could break things he shouldn't be able to break, overcome obstacles that should be insurmountable. He could have used this moment, her vulnerability, her proximity to take her down and attempt escape. But he didn't. Instead, he extended his wrists. Lissa secured the restraints herself and her hands were shaking. When she finished, she leaned forward until her forehead nearly touched his, and she whispered words that only he could hear. Words that changed everything. Break them, she said, her voice barely audible. When the time comes, break them. Please. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. Just show them. Show them what you are. Garrett realized then that she knew. Somehow, despite the sealed records and classified augmentation projects that even he didn't fully understand, Lissa had figured out that he wasn't what the profile said he was. That there was something else running through his DNA, buried in his genetic code. Something that made him capable of things normal humans couldn't do. Why would you do that? He asked. Because I'm tired of believing lies, she said. About everything. About you, about what humans are capable of. About what I'm supposed to want and feel and believe. She pulled back slightly and her iridescent gaze reflected the pale glow of the restraints between them. Because somewhere in the last 7 days, you stopped being a prisoner and started being everything. The weight of that confession hung in the air between them. Everything, not just something, not just important, everything. What does that mean, Garrett asked. For you, for your career, for everything you've built. It means I've made my choice, Lissa said. And tomorrow when they try to execute you, I need you to make yours. Break the restraints. Show them that their assumptions about humanity are wrong. Give me a reason to act. She straightened, stepping back, her face returning to that mask of professional composure. But her eyes held his for one more moment, and in that moment he saw everything she wasn't saying. The fear, the determination, the absolute commitment to a course of action that would destroy her life as she knew it. Then she left and Garrett was alone with the restraints and the knowledge of what dawn would bring. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on the bunk and thought about Earth, about forests in Colorado where he'd grown up, about mountains that touched the sky and rivers that ran clear and cold. He thought about the academy where he'd trained, though his memories of childhood before that were strangely absent. Just blank spaces where experiences should be. He thought about Lissa, about the impossible choice she was making, about the fact that she was willing to throw away everything she'd built, every loyalty and oath and commitment, because she'd seen something in him that contradicted the comfortable lies her species told itself about humanity. And he thought about those restraints on his wrists, about the certainty buried deep in his cells that when the moment came, he would be able to break them, that he was capable of something the Valoran didn't expect, something even he didn't fully understand. The guards came for him at dawn. They moved with professional efficiency, neither cruel nor kind, just following protocols that had been established long before Garrett's capture. They led him through corridors that gleamed with alien technology, past viewports that showed the endless void of space beyond the ship's hull. Lissa was waiting in the execution chamber. She wore her dress uniform, every element of it perfect and precise. Her face showed nothing. No emotion, no recognition, just the cold authority of a military commander overseeing a necessary duty. But when her eyes met his for just a fraction of a second, Garrett saw everything she was feeling. The terror, the desperate hope, the absolute conviction that what was about to happen would either save them both or destroy them completely. The chamber was a sphere, walls of polished metal that reflected distorted images back at anyone inside. The lighting came from above, harsh and unforgiving, rendering everything in stark white contrast. In the center, a platform rose from the floor, and technicians were already preparing the restraint mechanisms that would secure him during the execution. They worked with clinical precision, not looking at him, not acknowledging him as anything more than an object to be processed. Garrett let them position him on the platform. Let them check the ceremonial restraints Lissa had placed on him the night before. Let them activate the systems that would, in theory, compress and destroy with impossible pressure. Across the chamber, the executioner waited. A massive Valoran male named Varen Kresh, easily twice Garrett's size with scarred forearms that spoke of countless previous executions. He carried the activation device, a small remote that would trigger the restraint's lethal cascade. Lissa stood to the side watching, Her face remained that perfect mask, but her hands clasped behind her back in formal military posture were trembling. Only someone looking very carefully would notice. Only someone who knew her intimately would understand what that tremor meant. Baron Kresh approached. His expression was professional detachment, neither sadistic nor sympathetic. This was just his function, his purpose within the military hierarchy. Your last words, he asked. Apparently even condemned humans were granted this final courtesy. Garrett's gaze found Lissa's across the chamber. Tell them we're capable of more than they believe, he said. Varen activated the sequence. The restraints hummed to Lahieskif, power surging through the binding mechanisms with a sound like rising thunder. They were designed to generate impossible amounts of pressure to compress and break and destroy anything caught within their grip. The technology represented decades of Valoran engineering innovation. The pain hit Garrett like being struck by a collapsing star. White-hot and all-encompassing, radiating from his wrists up through his arms and into his chest. Every nerve ending screamed, every muscle locked. For a fraction of a second, he thought Lysa had been wrong, that there was nothing special about him and that he was just a human facing Valoran technology he couldn't possibly overcome. Then something deeper responded, something buried in his DNA that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Garrett pulled, not violently, not in panic, with absolute conviction, drawing on reserves he didn't know he possessed. The restraint on his left wrist screamed under the pressure metal and technology that represented years of engineering innovation beginning to fracture. Stress points appeared. Microscopic cracks propagated. The binding mechanisms started to fail. Half a second. That's how long it took. The first restraint broke, shattered completely. Fragments of metal and composite materials fell away from his arm like rain clattering against the platform. The second restraint followed barely a fraction of a second later. The pain was immense, but the strength was greater. His right wrist came free, restraint fragments cascading down like broken dreams. Total elapsed time from activation to liberation less than 3 seconds. Varen Kresh's expression shifted from professional detachment to pure shock. He stepped back instinctively, one hand reaching for a secondary weapon at his belt. But Garrett was already moving. Not toward the exit, not toward escape, toward him. Precise, controlled, operating on pure instinct and that deep cellular knowledge that had finally awakened. The Valoran male raised his arms defensively. His size and training were evident in his stance, in the way he positioned himself to absorb impact. But augmented human strength met trained Valoran muscle, and the collision was catastrophic. Garrett's hands closed on Varen's head with clinical efficiency. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where the larger being understood what was happening. His eyes widened. His massive frame tensed every muscle, preparing for resistance that wouldn't matter. Then Garrett twisted. The sound of vertebrae separating echoed through the execution chamber. A wet crack that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Varen's body went completely limp, every muscle releasing simultaneously as the spinal cord severed. He dropped like discarded equipment, his massive frame hitting the platform with a sound of absolute finality. Garrett turned toward the chamber exit, fragments of restraint still falling from his wrists. The executioner's body motionless behind him. His breathing was steady, his hands weren't shaking, and his gaze, when it found Lissa across the chamber, held no fear whatsoever. And Commander Lissa Kalor froze. That was the moment that would define everything that came after. She stood absolutely still, her iridescent eyes locked on him, watching him shed technology that should have killed him and overcome an opponent that should have been his superior in every measurable way. Her expression fractured, loyalty warring with revelation, duty colliding with desire, disbelief meeting undeniable proof. She saw what he was, what he'd always been buried under classified files and hidden programs. She saw him as something beyond human limitation, as something beautiful and terrible and utterly extraordinary, as the complete contradiction of everything she'd been taught to believe about his species. Every belief I've held just shattered, she thought, the realization cascading through her consciousness like a tidal wave. Everything they told me about humans was a lie, and I've been enforcing those lies with the full weight of military authority. The guards who'd been stationed outside the chamber were moving to intercept weapons, charging shouting commands that Garrett couldn't quite hear through the ringing in his ears. But they hesitated when they saw Lissa, when they looked to her for orders that didn't come. "Stand down," she commanded. Her voice cut through the chaos of sirens and rushing footsteps like a blade. The soldiers who'd been moving toward Garrett paused, uncertainty cascading through their ranks. Command authority was absolute in the Valoran military. No one questioned a direct order from a superior officer. "The execution is complete," Lissa continued, her voice carrying perfect military conviction, even as she spoke an obvious lie. "The chamber is secured. Everyone out." Now, the soldiers obeyed. They streamed toward the exit, none of them questioning why their commander was ordering them away from a prisoner who just killed an executioner and shattered advanced restraints that should have been unbreakable. None of them understanding what was actually happening, what was about to happen. When they were alone, Garrett and Lissa faced each other across the blood-smeared platform. Varen's body lay between them like a bridge neither had wanted to build, but both had crossed anyway. "What are you?" she whispered. "I don't know," Garrett said, and it was the absolute truth. "I just know that I didn't want to die without understanding what happens if I refuse to." Lissa made a decision. It crossed her face visibly, the exact moment when duty transformed into something infinitely more powerful than obligation. She moved toward the door and locked it from the inside, sealing the chamber. "Sealing their fates together. We're leaving," she said. "Together. Right now." Garrett crossed the platform in 3 long strides. When he reached her, Lissa didn't hesitate. She pulled him against her, and her mouth found his in a kiss that tasted like electricity and revolution. Like choosing chaos over control, like burning every bridge and walking forward into the unknown together with nothing but conviction and desperate hope. When they broke apart, her irises were running through an entire spectrum of colors, emotion rendered visible in the shifting patterns. "I'm betraying everything," she said. "My species, my command, my oath, everything I've ever been. I know, there's no going back from this. I know that too." "Then let's go forward," she said, "and show them what we're both capable of." Lissa led him through maintenance corridors she'd memorized during her years of service on this vessel. Every turn, every junction, every access panel was part of a mental map she'd been building subconsciously since the moment she'd whispered for him to break the restraints. Her security credentials opened doors that should have stayed sealed, but they wouldn't stay open for long. Once Central Command realized what she was doing, they'd cascade lock the entire ship's security system. "How long until they override your access?" Garrett asked, following close behind her as they descended through another level. 7 minutes when I started," Lissa said. "Maybe 4 left now." They'd already used 3 minutes getting from the execution chamber to the maintenance shafts. That left 1 minute to reach the auxiliary hangar and get a ship powered up and launched before the entire vessel locked down and trapped them inside. The hangar appeared ahead, and Lissa felt a surge of relief. A small diplomatic shuttle sat on the launch platform, its engines already warm from recent use. Someone from the diplomatic corps must have just returned from a mission. Perfect timing. She sprinted toward the boarding ramp while Garrett checked the corridor behind them for pursuit. The shuttle systems came online immediately when she accessed the command console. Pre-flight checks were green, fuel cells charged, navigation systems calibrated, everything ready for immediate departure. Garrett threw himself inside just as the first of the pursuing soldiers rounded the distant corner, weapons charging with that distinctive Valoran energy signature. Lissa sealed the hatch immediately, her hands flying across the launch controls. "Hold on," she said. The engines fired. Through the viewport, Garrett watched the hangar bay doors begin their closure sequence. They were 15 seconds from a hard stop against solid metal, and the shuttle was still accelerating toward the shrinking gap. Lissa pulled up on the controls with force that left her arms trembling. The shuttle's nose tilted upward, angled for the narrowing space between the closing doors. Metal screamed as the doors caught the shuttle's trailing edge. A burst of sparks and rupturing alloy, but they were through, shooting out into the void beyond. Space. Open, beautiful, uncontrolled space. The Valoran warship receded behind them, its weapon systems trying to lock on but unable to acquire a stable target before Lissa engaged the faster-than-light drive. The jump sequence activated, and the stars around them elongated into lines of pure light. Lissa's hands dropped from the controls. She was trembling now, adrenaline and the weight of what she'd just done crashing down on her simultaneously. The magnitude of her betrayal, the finality of her choice, everything she'd been, everything she'd worked for, everything she'd believed about herself and her purpose all of it gone in the space of minutes. Garrett crossed the cockpit and pulled her up from the pilot's seat. He kissed her with all the intensity she'd shown him in the execution chamber, his hands cradling her face, his mouth tasting her fear and her determination and her relief. When they broke apart, Lissa's eyes were the color of stormy twilight, flowing through 100 shades as she looked at him. "I just committed treason," she said. The words sounded like a confession. "You saved my life," Garrett said. "More than that." She pressed her forehead against his. "I broke every vow. I betrayed my command. I'm hunted now as much as you are. Every ship in the fleet will be looking for me. My face will be transmitted across every Valorant outpost. I can never go home." Garrett understood what she was really saying. "I chose you over everything I've ever known." Why, he asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Because when you broke those restraints, I realized that everything I've been taught about humanity, about you, was a lie," Lisa said. "And I'd rather face the truth with you than spend the rest of my life believing comfortable falsehoods and enforcing them on others." She kissed him again, deeper this time, and Garrett felt the moment shift from survival into something else entirely. Danger still surrounded them, pursuit was inevitable, but so was possibility. The future was uncertain and terrifying and full of potential. But there was something she hadn't told him yet, something she'd done before the execution that might give them a chance. "I need to show you something," Lissa said, pulling back. She moved to a storage compartment and retrieved a small data chit, the kind used for classified military intelligence. "I stole this before I brought you the restraints, before I committed to this path. I didn't know if I'd actually go through with the betrayal, but I wanted insurance. Leverage. Something." "What is it?" Garrett asked. "Your files," Lissa said. "Everything the Valorant military intelligence has on you. On human augmentation programs. On classified projects that your government and mine don't want anyone to know about. It's heavily encrypted, but the information is there." Garrett took the chit, feeling the weight of it. "How did you access this command privilege?" Lissa said. "And a willingness to violate protocols I've followed my entire career. I started looking into your background after the third night I visited your cell. Something about you didn't match our profiles, and I needed to understand why. What I found, the fragments I could access without triggering security alerts, suggested something much bigger than a simple human ship captain." "Can you decrypt it?" Garrett asked. "Not with the systems on this shuttle," Lissa said. "But I know where we can go. There's a black market station called Refuge, orbiting a dead star at the edge of the Colorado sector. They have the kind of specialists who can break military encryption. For the right price." "How long to get there?" 6 hours at current FTL velocity," Lissa said. "And I have credits, accounts that aren't linked to my military identity, money I've been saving for years without really knowing why." The journey to Refuge Station passed in tense silence. They took turns monitoring sensors for pursuit, but the Valorant fleet seemed to have lost their trail in the initial escape. Either that, or they were holding back, tracking from a distance, waiting to see where the fugitives would run before springing a trap. Refuge Station was exactly what its name suggested, a massive construct of salvaged ships in welded metal that had been added to haphazardly for centuries, orbiting a stellar corpse that gave off barely enough radiation to register on standard sensors. The kind of place that attracted people with nowhere else to go. Smugglers, thieves, political exiles, anyone fleeing violence or fate. Lissa docked the shuttle in a bay that asked no questions and demanded no identification. A man in a respirator met them as they disembarked. Human, or at least mostly human, with cybernetic enhancements that glowed faintly beneath his skin. "Need access to restricted archives?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries or introductions. Lissa produced the data chit. "Military encryption, classified government records. I need it broken." The man examined the chit, then looked at her with augmented eyes that shifted through calculating colors. "That's going to take time and credits. Lots of both. I can provide both," Lissa said. She had accounts scattered across 3 different star systems, access to funds that wouldn't be tracked immediately. "How long?" 12 hours, the man said. "Maybe more, depending on how deep the encryption goes." He paused. "This is Valorant military spec. Breaking this is going to send flags all over their intelligence networks." "They're already hunting us," Garrett said. "A few more flags won't change anything." The man shrugged and disappeared back into the station's depths without waiting for further discussion. Garrett and Lissa found a hostel that rented space by the hour and asked no questions about who was sharing it. The walls were thin enough that they could hear neighboring arguments and intimate moments alike. It felt worlds away from the military efficiency of the warship. "Tell me about Earth," Lissa said, lying on the narrow bed beside him. They were clothed, but her fingers were intertwined with his, and there was no distance between them. Garrett talked for hours. He described the oceans as best he could remember them. The salt taste, the sound of waves, the way the sun looked, reflecting off water. He told her about food that came from actual plants, about the smell of rain on dust, about the disorientation of a sky that changed colors with the time of day. "No constants," he said. "It's almost chaotic compared to a warship. But there's beauty in that impermanence. Every moment is unique. You can't predict or control it." "That sounds terrifying," Lissa said. "It is. It's also exhilarating." Garrett squeezed her hand. "I think you'd like it. You'd be overwhelmed by the humidity and the lack of organized systems, but you'd like it." "Would we go there?" Lissa asked. "If we escaped, if we actually managed to survive all this?" "We'd have to hide," Garrett said carefully. "Both the Valoran military and whoever ran the augmentation program would hunt us. Earth would be the first place they'd look. Too obvious." "What about the colonies?" Lissa asked. "The outer settlements where you grew up?" "Same problem," Garrett said. "Too obvious, too easy to predict." He rolled over to face her fully. "I think we're fugitives forever, at least until we figure out what we actually are and why we exist. Then maybe we have leverage. Maybe that becomes our bargaining chip." Lissa's eyes flowed through colors, the rapid cascading that meant she was thinking through complex problems. "If the augmentation program was classified at the highest levels of human government, then there are people who want it kept secret," she said. "And if I'm right about Valoran involvement, if we influence the program or help develop the genetic modifications, then my people have the same motivation to silence us. We're threats to both species," Garrett realized. "Worse," Lissa said, "we're proof of hidden collaboration. If it comes out that human and Valoran governments work together on weaponized genetic programs, that information alone could destabilize everything. Peace treaties, trade agreements, the entire political structure that's been built over the last century. The weight of that understanding settled over them. They weren't just hunted because they were fugitives. They were hunted because their very existence represented truths that powerful people had invested enormous effort in keeping buried." 12 hours later, the man in the respirator returned with the decoded files. They spent the next 6 hours in a private reading room absorbing the information contained in the classified data. Garrett's hands were shaking by the end of it. The augmentation program had started 40 years ago, initiated by both human and Valoran governments during a brief period of unprecedented cooperation between the species. The goal was straightforward and terrifying in its implications. Create a soldier who could operate in any environment, who combined human adaptability with Valoran physical supremacy. Someone who could be placed as a spy or operative anywhere undetectable because they appeared fully human but could match Valoran soldiers in combat capability. Garrett was one of 327 subjects. The program had been terminated 20 years ago, officially labeled a failure, though the files suggested that wasn't the whole truth. Some subjects had proven too unpredictable, combining human creativity with augmented strength in ways the designers hadn't anticipated. There had been incidents, casualties, political complications when certain subjects discovered what had been done to them. The rest of the subjects were scattered across different locations. Some remained in military service, unaware of their origins. Some had been terminated when they proved dangerous or unstable. Others had simply vanished from all records, disappeared into the vast spaces between stars. But there was something else in the files, something that made Lissa go very still as she read. The Valoran military hadn't just supported the program. They'd provided the genetic templates, the biological frameworks that made the augmentation possible. Valoran scientists had worked alongside human researchers, sharing knowledge that should have remained classified within each species. "My people did this," Lissa whispered. "We helped create you. We helped turn 327 humans into weapons without their consent." She looked at Garrett with something like horror in her expression. "I've been serving a government that participated in this, that knew about this, that kept it secret while telling us humans were inferior and primitive." Garrett put his hand on her shoulder. "You didn't know. That doesn't make it better," Lissa said. I should have questioned more, should have looked deeper, should have seen the inconsistencies in what we were told about human capabilities. There was more in the files. Coordinates buried in encrypted layers, references to a network other augmented subjects who'd realized what they were and rejected government control. A resistance building in hidden places, gathering others like them. We're not alone, Garrett said, pointing to the documentation. There are others, people like me who figured it out and are trying to survive. Do we trust them, Lissa asked. This could be a trap. Intelligence agencies seed false information all the time to draw out targets. We don't have a choice, Garrett said. We can't survive indefinitely on our own. We need allies, people who understand what we're facing. Lissa studied the coordinates. It's a long journey, 3 days of FTL travel. If it's a trap, we'll be walking right into it. If it's real, Garrett said, we'll finally have a chance to understand what I am, what was done to me, why I can break restraints that should be unbreakable and kill opponents I should have no chance against. Lissa made the decision quickly, the way commanders learn to make choices in combat when hesitation meant death. We go, she said. We find these people, we learn what they know, and then we decide what comes next. They left Refuge Station with a new destination plotted into the shuttle's navigation systems. A location that wasn't on any official star charts, identified only by coordinates that had been buried deep in the encrypted files. If the network was real, if other augmented subjects were actually gathering somewhere, that was their only chance at survival. Their only hope of turning from hunted fugitives into something more. Something that could negotiate. Something that could fight back. The flight would take 3 days. The colony existed on a moon orbiting a terraformed world in the new Arizona system, far enough from established trade routes that most ships avoided it entirely. As Garrett and Lissa dropped out of FTL, the moon resolved on their view screen, all gray stone and impact craters, the kind of desolate rock that attracted no attention and offered no resources worth claiming. But the life sign readings told a different story. Hundreds of signatures deep beneath the surface, concentrated in cavern systems that had been carved by ancient geological processes and then expanded through deliberate engineering. They're expecting us, Lissa said quietly, watching as a beacon activated on the moon's surface, broadcasting landing coordinates and automated docking protocols. How did they know we were coming? Garrett asked. Maybe they've been monitoring anyone who accesses those files, Lissa suggested. Maybe we weren't the first to find them. The landing bay was carved directly into the lunar rock, vast enough to accommodate ships 10 times the size of their small shuttle. As Lissa guided them through the entry tunnel and onto a designated platform, Garrett counted at least 15 other vessels in various states of maintenance. Some looked like military craft that had been stripped of insignia. Others were civilian transports modified for speed and stealth. All of them bore the signs of hard use and harder journeys. A greeting party waited as the shuttle's engines powered down. 3 figures standing at the edge of the platform, their body language neither threatening nor entirely welcoming. Just watchful, assessing. The center figure was a woman in her 40s, human with silver streaking through dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She wore utilitarian clothing that suggested function over form, and when she moved, it was with a controlled grace that spoke of extensive combat training. The figure to her left was male Valoran, with skin the color of storm clouds and irises that shifted between gray and violet. But something about his proportions was slightly off for a pure Valoran. His features held traces of human structure, a hybrid, Garrett realized, something that shouldn't be possible according to everything both species understood about genetic compatibility. The third figure was almost entirely Valoran in appearance, female with the characteristic lavender skin and silver hair. But she moved with human unpredictability, and when she smiled, there was something in her expression that belonged to neither species entirely. "Welcome to Sanctuary," the human woman said, as Lissa and Garrett descended the boarding ramp. Her voice carried the accent of someone who'd grown up speaking multiple languages. "I'm Dr. Alara Thorne. We've been waiting for you." Waiting how long? Lissa asked, her military instincts making her cautious despite the apparent welcome. "Since the moment you accessed those encrypted files on Refuge Station," Alara replied. "The network has monitoring algorithms embedded in certain data streams. When someone decodes classified augmentation project files, we know about it within hours. Usually it means someone like you is about to need help very badly." She gestured toward a tunnel leading deeper into the moon. "Come." There's a lot to explain and not much time before your former command starts searching this sector more aggressively. They were brought to a command center carved into the lunar core surrounded by technology that represented an impossible fusion of human and Valorant engineering. Hybrid systems that shouldn't exist but clearly did, optimized in ways that neither species had achieved independently. The walls were lined with holographic displays showing star charts, fleet positions, and what looked like population distribution maps across 7 different star systems. 327 of us were created, Alara explained, pulling up files that made the ones they decoded on Refuge Station look like elementary summaries. Across multiple generations, multiple locations, multiple phases of the program. Some in human space, some in Valorant territory, some in disputed zones where neither government wanted to officially acknowledge what they were doing. The displays showed faces, humans and Valorans in beings that seemed to be neither or both, ages ranging from children to elderly. Some marked as active, some as deceased, some simply listed as unknown status. "We're finding each other slowly," the hybrid male said. His name was Cale Thorne, and despite his mixed heritage, his accent was pure Valoran. Building this network one person at a time. Some of us rejected the program entirely when we learned about it and went independent. Others are still embedded in military service gathering intelligence and trying to understand the full scope of what was done to us. "Why are you doing this?" Lessa asked. She'd positioned herself slightly between Garrett and the others, a protective stance she probably didn't realize she'd adopted. "What's the endgame? Because we're not weapons," Alara said simply. "We're people, and we deserve to understand what we are instead of being told comfortable lies about our origins and purposes. We deserve agency over our own lives." Garrett stepped forward, studying the deployment patterns on the holographic maps. The way the network members were slowly positioning themselves across human and Valoran space concentrated near critical infrastructure and military installations. "You're not just gathering for personal understanding," he said. "You're building something, preparing for something." Alara met his gaze directly. "We're preparing to survive," she said. "If either government realizes we exist in this concentration, in this level of organization, what do you think happens? They don't negotiate with us. They don't offer us seats at diplomatic tables. They eliminate the threat before it becomes unmanageable." "So you're planning contingencies," Lissa said, "positioning yourselves to leverage both species against each other if necessary." "We're planning to make ourselves too valuable to simply destroy," Alara corrected, "and too distributed to eliminate easily." She gestured to a private chamber off the main command center. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we'll have real discussions about what role you want to play in what's coming. For now, just know that you're as safe here as anyone like us can be anywhere." The chamber they were given had walls of natural stone that had been smoothed and sealed with equipment that spoke of long-term occupation rather than temporary shelter. There was a bed, a refresher unit, storage for personal effects, the basics of habitation carved out of lunar bedrock. Garrett pulled Lissa close as soon as the doors sealed behind them. She fit against him perfectly, her head resting against his chest, her breathing gradually slowing from the heightened state of alert she'd maintained since landing. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We can't trust them completely. Their goals might not align with ours. But we can't survive without them either." "I don't know yet," Garrett admitted. "But I know we figure it out together. That's what matters. That's what's kept us alive this far." Lissa tilted her head up and Garrett kissed her. Slow this time. Tender. Reaffirming the connection that had started in stolen moments in an interrogation cell and had somehow become the foundation of everything that mattered. Her hands traced the muscles of his shoulders, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent. Something that spoke of desire mixing with the desperate need to feel alive after so much death and violence. What followed was different from their frantic first encounter on the shuttle after the execution. This was deliberate, careful attention to every response, every place that made her eyes flow through cascades of color. Garrett learned that the base of her ears was sensitive, that her collarbone carried patterns of pigmentation that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, that when she reached her peak, she made a sound like distant thunder rolling across mountains. In return, Lissa showed him that vulnerability could be its own form of strength. She ran her hands across the scars on his body marks from the restraints, old surgical scars from childhood modifications he couldn't remember receiving. She kissed each one like she was healing what had been broken in him long before they'd met. "I love you," she said afterward, the words coming simply without preamble or apology. "I should probably maintain some distance. Should probably worry about what that means strategically. But I don't want to. I'm tired of denying what I feel just because it's inconvenient or dangerous." "I love you too," Garrett said, realizing it was absolutely true. Somewhere between the interrogation cell and this moment, she'd become the center of his gravity, the fixed point around which everything else orbited. They fell asleep tangled together, but rest brought no peace. Garrett's dreams were fragments of memories that weren't quite memories, genetic echoes of events he'd never witnessed personally, but that lived in his DNA anyway. He saw laboratories with surgical equipment. He saw Valoran scientists working alongside humans, their collaboration seamless and practiced. He saw test subjects, some screaming as modifications failed catastrophically, others emerging from treatment chambers changed into something that was no longer quite what they'd been before. He saw himself as a child, 5 years old, maybe younger, being led into a white room by people in medical garments, feeling fear but not understanding why. Then nothing, just blank space where memories should continue. He woke in darkness to find Lissa already awake, watching him with those luminous, color-shifting eyes. "The network wants you," she said quietly. "They'll want you to lead eventually. You're exactly what they need. Human perspective, military training, augmented capability that you've proven works under extreme pressure. You could inspire them in ways Alara can't." "I don't want to lead," Garrett said. "I want to understand what I am, what was done to me. And then I want to choose what comes next rather than having it chosen for me like everything else in my life apparently has been." "That's exactly why they'll want you to lead," Lissa said. "Because you don't want power for its own sake. Because you understand what it means to make decisions that affect other people's lives." They spent the next 2 days integrating into the network's operations. Lissa proved immediately valuable, providing detailed intelligence about Valoran fleet deployments, patrol schedules, command protocols that could help the network avoid detection. Her knowledge of military operations was extensive, and Alara recognized its worth immediately. Garrett found himself in longer conversations with the other augmented subjects, learning their stories. A woman named Catherine, who'd been a teacher before discovering her enhanced strength during an accident that should have killed her. A man called James, who'd served in human military special operations for 15 years before reading a classified file he wasn't supposed to access. Dozens of others, each with their own path to this hidden sanctuary, each carrying the weight of being something neither government wanted to acknowledge existed. On the third morning, everything changed. The seismic monitors detected the orbital bombardment before any other system registered the threat. The displays in the command center erupted with warnings, showing multiple vessels dropping out of FTL in coordinated attack positions above the moon. Human ships and Valoran fleet elements working together with a precision that spoke of careful planning and shared intelligence. They knew Alara set her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them as network members rushed to battle stations. "About this location, about our concentration here, about exactly when we'd be most vulnerable." The question is how they both found out at the same time. Someone leaked, Garrett realized. Double agent, someone in the network sold us out to both governments simultaneously. The colony's defenses activated automatically. Weapon systems that had been concealed in the lunar rock shield generators that created overlapping fields of protection across critical structures. But the attacking forces had superior numbers and overwhelming firepower. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission or a warning. This was an extermination operation. What followed was a battle that mixed conventional warfare with guerrilla tactics, the kind of fight that played to the network's advantages, even though they were dramatically outnumbered. The attackers had to penetrate the cavern systems to reach the defenders, which negated much of their technological superiority, and forced close-quarters combat where augmented abilities mattered more than ship-mounted weapons. Garrett found himself in combat almost immediately, moving through corridors with Lissa at his side. She was every bit his equal in the fight, faster than human soldiers pursuing them, stronger than her primarily Valoran physiology should allow. Together they were devastating, not through maximizing violence, but through perfect coordination. They anticipated each other's movements, covered each other's vulnerabilities, moved as a single unit with twice the combat effectiveness. 3 Valoran soldiers cornered them in a supply storage chamber. Garrett recognized the insignia on their uniforms immediately. They were from Lysa's former ship, her former crew, people she'd commanded and trained alongside for years. Commander Kaylor, the lead soldier, said his weapon trained on her center mass. You're under arrest for treason in violation of military protocols. You're to surrender immediately for court-martial and sentencing. Lysa's weapon remained steady, aimed at the soldier's chest. I'm not your commander anymore, she said calmly. I resigned that position when I chose truth over comfortable lies, when I chose to see clearly instead of enforcing blindness on others. You're a classified asset under Protocol 7 jurisdiction. The soldier continued, shifting his aim toward Garrett. Your designation and loyalties are irrelevant to your legal status. You belong to the Valoran military by treaty and binding agreement. My designation is Lysa Kaylor, she said. Not commander, not asset, not property of the Valoran fleet. I'm a person making my own choices, and neither is he your property to reclaim. The soldier's finger tightened on the trigger. Lysa fired first. The energy bolt caught him in the shoulder and spun him backward into his companions. The other two soldiers fired in response, and what followed was a brutal exchange in close quarters. Garrett moved through the space using combat techniques he'd never formally learned, but somehow knew anyway, his augmented strength allowing him to disarm and incapacitate without necessarily killing when he could avoid it. When it ended, 3 soldiers lay on the chamber floor. None of them dead, though 2 were badly injured and would need immediate medical attention. Garrett's chest was heaving, and Lysa looked at him with something like fierce pride in her color-shifting eyes. We need to fall back, she said, pointing to a secondary exit. They're advancing from multiple access points simultaneously. The colony's getting overrun. We can't hold them indefinitely. The evacuation order came through communication channels as they fought their way toward the deepest sections of the complex. Alara's voice calm and controlled despite the chaos, directing network members to hidden hangar facilities that had been prepared for exactly this scenario. How many are we getting out? Garrett asked when they finally reached the evacuation point. The hangar was massive, carved from solid rock with multiple transports already powering up their engines. About 200, Alara replied. She was directing traffic with efficient precision, ensuring the transports launched in sequence to avoid creating clustered targets in the confined exit tunnel. At least 100 haven't made it to the hangar yet. Another 50 we know aren't coming at all. They're holding defensive positions to buy us time to escape. Those 50 wouldn't be coming. Garrett understood what Alara wasn't saying directly. They were sacrificing themselves to ensure others survived, making the same calculation he'd made 100 times as a ship captain, determining whose survival mattered most in an impossible situation where everyone couldn't be saved. Garrett grabbed Lysa's arm and pulled her toward a smaller transport, one of the fastest vessels in the hangar, built for speed and evasion rather than capacity or comfort. Get these people out, he told Alara. Get them somewhere safe. Find the other network cells scattered across the systems and warn them that both governments are coordinating openly now. The secret cooperation isn't secret anymore. What are you doing? Alara demanded. Being a distraction, Garrett said. They want Protocol 7, the classified asset, the proof that the program worked. Let them chase us while the rest of you scatter and disappear. That's suicide, Lysa said flatly, her grip on his wrist tightening. Maybe, Garrett replied. Or maybe we figure out what leverage we actually have and use it to negotiate an exit for everyone. But we can't do that if we're running with 200 other fugitives. We need to draw the pursuit away. Lysa's hand clamped harder strength that would have shattered bone in an unaugmented human. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice carrying absolute conviction. We established that already. Together or not at all. That was the deal from the beginning. Alara made a gesture and 2 network operatives moved to the hangar's main doors, beginning the launch sequence for the larger transports. Alarms screamed as the vessels began to rise on anti-gravity fields, accelerating toward the exit tunnel that would carry them to the lunar surface and then space beyond. Garrett and Lysa sealed themselves into the smaller ship just as the first wave of attacking forces reached the hangar level. Weapons fire erupted across the vast space, catching the trailing edge of their launch sequence. The small transport shuddered, but held, rising faster than the larger vessels, accelerating with desperate urgency toward the tunnel exit. Behind them, through the viewport, Garrett caught a glimpse of the battle continuing. Network members making their final stand, buying seconds and minutes with their bodies and their lives. He saw two augmented subjects take defensive positions at the hangar entrance, their enhanced capabilities allowing them to hold against impossible odds for those precious extra moments. Those seconds had a price he couldn't calculate, wouldn't let himself calculate, because thinking about it would crack something inside him that needed to stay whole for whatever came next. I'll jump in 10 seconds. Lissa called from the pilot's seat, her hands moving across controls with absolute certainty. Hold on. The transport jumped to faster than light velocity, and the moon receded behind them, becoming a point of light, and then nothing at all. A place that had represented hope and community and the possibility of understanding, now probably a tomb for people who'd only wanted to know what they were and why they'd been created. They made it through 3 jump sequences before the hunters found them again. Human vessels and Valosian warships working in coordinated pursuit patterns that spoke of official cooperation at the highest levels of both governments. The secret alliance that had created the augmentation program was no longer secret, at least not to the military forces tasked with cleaning up the evidence of its existence. Lissa pushed the small transport to its absolute limits, making evasive maneuvers that would have torn apart a less advanced ship. The shuttle screamed in protest, hull plating, superheating, from the stress of rapid course changes at velocities that pushed the boundaries of what the engines could sustain. There she said, pointing at a storm-racked world with atmospheric chaos visible even from high orbit. We can lose them in those weather systems. Hide in the surface canyons where sensors can't penetrate effectively. The descent was brutal. The transport wasn't designed for planetary entry under combat conditions, and the storm fronts added complications that made every second feel like falling through multiple layers of hell. Lightning arced across their bow. Atmospheric turbulence threw them sideways hard enough that Garrett thought the hull might buckle. But Lissa was an exceptional pilot, and Garrett had never doubted that. They hit the surface in a canyon carved by ancient water flow, surrounded by stone formations that would confuse targeting systems and hide them from orbital surveillance. The engine shut down with a sound like a death rattle. Silence fell, broken only by the howling wind outside and the creaking of stressed hull plating cooling in the thin atmosphere. How long? Garrett asked. 12 hours if we're lucky, Lissa said, her hands finally leaving the controls, before they reacquire our position and send ground forces. Maybe less if they're willing to saturate the area with orbital bombardment and sort through the debris afterward. She looked exhausted, furious, heartbroken, all of it written across her face in ways she'd never have allowed when she was still a commander serving the Valoran fleet with unquestioning loyalty. We lost good people back there, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of command decisions that had gone wrong. People who trusted us to help keep them safe. People who looked to the network for protection and got death instead. I know, Garrett said, pulling her close. I'm military trained, Lissa continued. I understand casualties. I understand sacrifice and the mathematics of combat where some have to die so others can live. But this is different. These weren't soldiers who signed up knowing the risks and accepting them as part of service. These were people who just wanted to understand what had been done to them without their consent. You saved 200, Garrett reminded her, holding her tight as tremors ran through her body. You bought them time to scatter and survive. That matters. That's not nothing. It's not enough, Lissa said, and there was grief in her voice that cut deeper than any weapon. It never is. No matter how many you save, you remember the ones you couldn't, the ones who died buying time with their lives. But it's what we can do, Garrett replied. It's what we do now. We save who we can, and we keep moving forward because stopping means dying, and dying means they win completely. Lissa pulled back enough to look at him directly, her eyes flowing through colors that reflected her emotional state. What's the end game, Garrett? Where do we actually go from here? We can't run forever. Eventually, we run out of places to hide and people to help us and options to pursue. Garrett realized he finally had an answer. Not a comfortable answer, not a safe answer, but an answer that felt true in a way nothing else had since this entire sequence of events began. We don't run, he said. Lissa stared at him. What? We stop running. Garrett said, the plan forming even as he spoke. We've been reactive since the execution, fleeing, hiding, trying to stay ahead of pursuit. But that's not sustainable, and it's not going to lead anywhere except eventual capture or death. What are you suggesting? Lissa asked. We go on offense, Garrett said. We take the information, we have everything we learned from those files and from the network, and we make it public. Broadcast it across every frequency we can access. Human networks, Valorant networks, civilian channels, military channels, everything. We force the truth into spaces where lies have been comfortable for decades. They'll kill us, Lissa said flatly. Maybe Garrett agreed. Probably. But the information will already be out there. And 200 network members will have time to establish themselves in hiding while both governments are dealing with the political fallout of their populations, learning they've been lied to for 40 years. Lissa was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. When she spoke again, her voice was different, calmer, more resolved. You're right, she said. Running just delays the inevitable. But if we expose everything, if we make the conspiracy public and undeniable, we force both governments to respond. We change the dynamic from hunters pursuing fugitives to political leaders trying to manage a crisis of legitimacy. And maybe, Garrett said, just maybe that gives us enough leverage to negotiate. Not for ourselves necessarily, but for all the augmented subjects. For the right to exist without being hunted or controlled or treated as military assets instead of people. It's still probably suicide, Lissa said. Garrett smiled. Together or not at all. Remember, together, Lissa agreed and kissed him. When the planetary sensors detected incoming vessels 12 hours later, Garrett and Lissa didn't attempt to flee deeper into the canyon systems or hide in caves that might shield them from detection. Instead, they armed themselves with what weapons the shuttle carried, accessed the communication systems, and began broadcasting across every frequency they could reach. This is Commander Lysa Kaylor of the Valorant Fifth Fleet. Lissa's voice rang out across military channels, civilian networks, diplomatic frequencies, everything their systems could access simultaneously. And Captain Garrett Ashford designated Protocol 7 under classified augmentation programs. We are transmitting complete documentation of Project Apex Humanity, classified cooperation between human and Valorant governments spanning 4 decades, genetic experimentation on unwilling subjects, 327 victims across multiple generations and locations. This information is now public and distributed across every communications network we could access. The truth is out, the lies are over, data flooded outward from their position, everything they'd found in the decoded files. Everything Alara had shared about the network's research over years of investigation. Evidence of the collaboration between species that were supposedly enemies. Names of officials involved in both governments. Testimony from augmented subjects about what had been done to them without consent or knowledge. Technical specifications of the genetic modifications. Success rates and failure rates and casualty counts. All of it, everything, laid bare for anyone to see. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Military commanders on both sides went silent as the transmissions propagated through their networks at light speed. Encryptions were broken by civilian hackers within minutes. Firewalls were bypassed. Security protocols failed. The information spread like wildfire through every connected system, jumping from military databases to civilian networks, to diplomatic channels, to personal communication devices. Within an hour, populations across human and Valorant space were learning about decades of deception, about collaboration between governments that claimed to be adversaries, about genetic programs that violated every ethical principle both species claimed to hold sacred, about 327 people who'd been turned into weapons without ever being asked for consent. Garrett and Lissa waited in the shuttle weapons ready, fully understanding they were probably about to die. But they'd made the choice. They'd acted. They'd forced the truth into spaces where lies had been comfortable and profitable for too long. A single shuttle descended from the storm clouds 2 hours later. Not a military assault craft bristling with weapons. A diplomatic transport, sleek and unarmed, carrying representatives from both governments. High-level officials who'd been authorized to assess the damage and attempt some form of containment before the political situation spiraled completely out of control. The shuttle landed 50 meters from their position. 2 figures emerged wearing formal attire rather than military gear. A human woman with diplomatic credentials visible on her uniform and a Valorant council member whose insignia marked him as someone with serious political authority in the fleet command structure. Garrett and Lysa met them halfway between the 2 shuttles, weapons lowered but ready. You've created a political catastrophe, the council member said without preamble or pleasantries. Both our governments are in absolute chaos. There are calls for investigations, for war crimes tribunals, for complete restructuring of intelligence oversight, for heads of state to resign, for military commands to be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. There should be, Lissa said flatly, her voice carrying none of the deference she would have once shown to superior rank. What you did, what both our species did together, was unconscionable, a betrayal of every principle we claim to value, every ethic we claim to uphold. What do you want? The human diplomat asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer wouldn't be simple or easy. Safe passage, Garrett said clearly, for the network members who escaped the colony, for Lysa and myself, for anyone else involved in exposing this conspiracy, and a guarantee that Project Apex Humanity and all related programs are permanently terminated with full transparency about what was done and why. You're in no position to negotiate, the council member said, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew the truth. The balance of power had shifted the moment the information went public. Actually, I am, Lissa replied, and there was steel in her voice that reminded everyone present she'd been a military commander before she'd been a fugitive. Because right now, your populations are learning that you've been lying to them for 40 years, that you experimented on citizens of both species without consent, that you created weapons out of people and tried to hide them when they became politically inconvenient or started asking uncomfortable questions. The information is spreading faster than you can possibly contain it. You can either work with us to manage the narrative and offer legitimate accountability, or you can kill us and watch the entire situation explode into a war that neither species is prepared for and neither population wants. The human diplomat exchanged a long look with the Valoran council member. Entire conversations seemed to pass between them in that glance. Calculations about political survival. Assessments of what their respective populations would accept. Recognition that the old way of managing this situation through secrecy and elimination was no longer viable. This is beyond our immediate authority, the diplomat said finally. We need to consult with higher commands on both sides. This requires decisions at the highest levels of government. Then consult quickly, Garrett said, because there are network members scattered across multiple star systems right now. And if they decide to start releasing additional evidence, additional testimony, additional documentation that we haven't yet made public, your governments will become completely unsalvageable. You can do this the right way with truth and accountability and reparations to the people who were harmed. Or you can do it the hard way and lose everything, including the trust of your populations. The negotiation took 8 hours. Communication went back and forth between the diplomatic shuttle and command authorities across human and Valoran space. Garrett and Lissa waited in their transport, monitoring the discussions through intercepted channels, watching as political structures began to crack and shift under the weight of revealed truth. Arguments erupted in government chambers. Military commands split between those who wanted to maintain secrecy at any cost and those who recognized the situation had fundamentally changed. Civilian populations demanded answers. Media organizations broadcast the leaked files continuously. The entire political landscape of both species was transforming in real time. Finally, after 8 hours of intense negotiation and consultation with the highest levels of both governments, an agreement emerged. Not perfect, not justice in any complete sense, but survival and the beginning of accountability. Lissa would receive asylum status with full legal protections. Her knowledge about Valoran augmentation programs was too valuable to lose, and exile was politically preferable to execution or imprisonment. She would never hold military command again, but she would be protected from prosecution for her actions and free to live as she chose. Garrett would be released to a neutral settlement designated as an independent party rather than a military asset or government property. He would cooperate with official investigations into the augmentation programs, providing testimony and information, but would not be compelled to serve either government in any capacity. Protected status as long as he maintained that cooperation. The network members who'd escaped the colony assault would be granted similar provisions. Not full amnesty, which was politically impossible, but protected status and freedom from persecution as long as they agreed to certain restrictions on political organization and militant activity. The augmentation programs would be permanently terminated with full public disclosure of what had been done. Reparations would be established for victims and their families. Independent oversight would be created to ensure no similar programs were initiated in the future. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete justice for what had been done to hundreds of people across decades. But it was the possibility of truth finally beginning to emerge after so long being buried under layers of classified secrecy and political convenience. As they prepared to leave the planet under diplomatic escort, Lissa and Garrett had one final night together in the small transport before everything changed again. They knew the investigations would separate them temporarily, that duties and obligations in the machinery of two different governmental systems would pull them in different directions for a while as the formal processes unfolded. "This isn't over," Lissa said, lying against his chest in the darkness. "It's just changing into something different, into something we can actually serve him instead of just running from endlessly." "I know," Garrett replied, his arms wrapped around her. "But we face it together even when we're not in the same place. We're connected now in ways that distance can't break. What we've been through, what we've chosen, that bonds us permanently." "You have faith," Lissa said quietly, "in systems, in governments, in the possibility that truth will actually lead to something better instead of just different forms of oppression." "I don't have faith in systems," Garrett corrected gently. "I have faith in you, in the network, in people who chose to risk everything for honesty even when lying would have been safer and easier. That's enough to build on. That's enough to hope for better." Lissa kissed him, and the kiss carried all the weight of their impossible journey. From interrogation cell to execution chamber, from betrayal to revelation, from hunted fugitives to people who'd changed the political landscape of two entire species through courage and commitment to truth. It was a promise, unspoken but absolute, that whatever came next, they would meet it together in spirit, if not always in physical proximity. 2 years later, Garrett received a message from Lissa. It contained coordinates to a settlement on a neutral world at the edge of mapped space, in a single line of text that made his heart surge with recognition and longing. "Come home." He understood immediately. Home wasn't a location on a star chart. It was a presence, a person who'd defied every expectation and chosen love over duty, revolution over safety, truth over comfortable lies that would have kept her secure and honored within her species' hierarchy. The settlement was on officially unclaimed space colonized by a mixture of humans, Valorans, and augmented subjects who'd found their own path forward after the revelations. Small, maybe 5,000 residents, but growing steadily as word spread about a place where species could coexist without the weight of historical conflicts and ancient prejudices. Lissa was waiting in a building overlooking plains where alien grasses grew in colors Earth had never produced. When Garrett entered, she was standing at a viewport watching twin suns paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson as they descended toward the horizon. She turned when she heard him, and her eyes flowed through colors that encompassed everything she felt. Violet, blue, silver, every shade reflecting the depth of her emotion and the journey they traveled together. "You came," she said simply, as if there had ever been any doubt. "Always," Garrett replied, crossing the space between them. "Every time. For as long as we exist. For as long as you want me." He kissed her, and it felt like coming home in the truest sense. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, deeper into an embrace that spoke of permanence and choice in futures built deliberately rather than accepted passively from authorities who claimed to know better. "They want us to lead," she said when they finally broke apart, still holding him close. "The Settlement Council. They want a human and Valoran partnership to oversee development, to prove that cooperation is actually possible when it's built on honesty and mutual respect instead of secret conspiracies and manipulation." "Is that what you want?" Garrett asked, though he could already see the answer in her eyes. "I want you," Lissa said without hesitation. "Everything else is just possibility. We can choose what to do with it based on what feels right and true, rather than what serves some hidden agenda." "Then let's lead," Garrett said, his hand finding hers. "Let's build something that shows both our species what we're capable of when we're honest with each other. When we stop lying about what we are and what we can become together. When we choose truth, even when it's difficult and inconvenient." They stood at the viewport, watching the twin suns descend below the horizon, painting the alien sky in colors neither Earth nor the Valorant homeworld had ever produced. Behind them, the settlement's lights were beginning to activate a small beacon of something genuinely new, emerging from the darkness of old conflicts and ancient lies. The truth about Project Apex Humanity continued to reshape political landscapes across human and Valorant space. Investigations were ongoing and would likely continue for years or even generations. Some called for broader reparations, others demanded more extensive justice. The process would be messy and imperfect and slow-filled with compromises and setbacks and partial victories. But the fundamental dynamic had changed permanently. The secret was no longer secret. The truth was beginning to transform into genuine understanding. And Garrett and Lissa, the human and the Valorant who'd chosen each other over everything else, stood at the center of that transformation as living proof that another way was possible. They were no longer fugitives running from overwhelming forces, no longer prisoners of systems that saw them as assets to be controlled, no longer military personnel following orders without question. They were free to become whatever they decided to be, together. Lissa's hand found Garrett's fingers intertwining in the gathering darkness as stars began to emerge overhead. Above them, the same stars that had carried them across the galaxy through danger and discovery. The same void that had isolated them and then freed them. The same infinite space that held both their histories and their futures. No regrets, she asked quietly, knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. Garrett turned to look at her fully, at the woman whose eyes shifted with every emotion, whose loyalty had cost her everything she'd built in her military career, whose love had given him understanding of what he actually was and what he could choose to become, rather than what had been chosen for him before he was old enough to have any say. Not a single one, he said, meaning it absolutely. She kissed him again, and the future stretched before them. Uncertain, beautiful, full of possibility and challenge, and the hard work of building something genuinely new from the ruins of old systems that had failed both their species. They'd survived execution chambers and battlefields, military hierarchies and governmental collapse, political conspiracies and species-wide deceptions. They'd found each other in darkness and chosen to build something honest together, something transparent, something that valued truth over comfortable lies. In a settlement on a neutral world at the edge of known space, a human and a Valorant stood together watching stars emerge in an alien sky. And for the first time in both their lives, the future wasn't something to fear or flee from or fight against with desperate survival instincts. It was something to move toward deliberately. Hand in hand, building rather than destroying, creating rather than consuming, together rather than alone when they went into whatever came next, with truth as their foundation and love as their guide. Together.